I knew something was wrong the moment Emily stopped looking at me the way she used to, and the scary part wasn't the silence or the late nights, it was how I convinced myself it all meant nothing, like I was standing in front of a burning house telling myself it was just warm, because the truth would destroy me, and I wasn't ready for that kind of pain. So when I asked her, "Emily, why are you coming home so late these days?" she didn't even hesitate before saying, "It's just work, Daniel, we're short-staffed," and I forced a smile, nodding like a fool, saying, "Yeah, that makes sense," even though something inside me twisted, something sharp and quiet that I chose to ignore, because loving her felt easier than questioning her. And later that night when she sat beside me scrolling through her phone, I tried again, softer this time, "You've been really busy lately," and she sighed like I was the problem, like I was the one making things complicated. "Daniel, please don't start, I'm just tired," and I immediately backed off. No, I'm not starting anything, I was just asking, because I didn't want a fight, I didn't want distance, I didn't want to lose her, and that's how it started. The small lies, the quiet avoidance, the way she'd turn her screen away just slightly when I walked by, the way her laughter on calls didn't sound like it used to when she talked to me, and I noticed everything but said nothing, because saying something would make it real and I wasn't ready for that. So instead I told myself stories. "She's stressed. Work is hard. You're overthinking," and I believed them because I needed to, until Marcus sat across from me one evening, staring at me like he already knew what I was too afraid to admit, and he said, "Daniel, I'm gonna be straight with you, something's off with Emily," and I laughed, too quickly, too defensively. "What?" "No man, she's just busy," and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Busy doesn't make someone disappear emotionally, you look like you're talking to a stranger lately," and I shrugged it off. "You're overthinking it," even though I knew I was the one doing that every night when I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling while Emily lay beside me with her back turned, her silence louder than any argument we'd never had. And one night I reached out, placing my hand gently on her arm, whispering, "Emily, are we okay?" And she froze for a second before replying, "Of course we are, why wouldn't we be?" And I swallowed hard, forcing a quiet, "I don't know, it just feels different." And she turned slightly, not fully facing me, just enough to end the conversation. "You're imagining things, Daniel," and that hurt more than if she had just been honest, because it made me question my own reality, like maybe I was the problem, maybe I was insecure, maybe I was ruining something good by doubting it. So I apologized. "Yeah, maybe I am, I'm sorry," and she didn't say anything back, just went back to her phone, and that silence became our normal. And the next morning when I saw a notification light up her screen while she was in the shower, I didn't pick up the phone, I didn't check, I just stared at it, my heart pounding like it already knew what I'd find, and I whispered to myself, "Don't do this." Because I didn't want proof, I didn't want confirmation, I wanted peace, even if it was fake. So I walked away, pretending I didn't see anything, pretending everything was fine, and when she came out, drying her hair, smiling like nothing was wrong, she asked, "You're leaving early today?" And I nodded, "Yeah, I got a lot to do," and she said, "Good, I'll probably be late again," and I forced another smile, "Of course you will," and she didn't catch the meaning behind that, or maybe she didn't care enough to, and as I stepped out of the apartment, Marcus's voice echoed in my head. "Something's wrong," and for the first time I didn't argue back in my mind, I just sighed and said quietly to myself, "I know." But even then I still wasn't ready to face it, because the truth wasn't just that Emily was changing, it was that I was losing her, slowly, quietly, right in front of me, and I was standing there watching it happen, choosing silence over reality, because I thought if I didn't say it out loud, if I didn't confront it, then maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be real. I didn't plan to see it, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it, and that was the night everything inside me started cracking, because I was driving back home, thinking about something simple like what to eat, when my eyes landed on Emily Harper's car parked outside a hotel, and I slowed down without even realizing it, whispering to myself, "No, that's not, it can't be," but I knew that car, I knew every scratch on it, every little detail, because I had washed it, fixed it, driven it, and I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding as I tried to come up with any explanation that didn't destroy me. Maybe Emily Harper is meeting a client, maybe it's work, maybe I'm overthinking again, and I almost drove away, I really did, but something kept me there, something heavy and undeniable, and I ended up parking across the street, staring at the entrance like an idiot, hoping I was wrong. But time passed, minutes stretching into something painful, and when Emily Harper finally walked out of that hotel, my chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe, because Emily Harper didn't look stressed, didn't look tired, didn't look like someone who had been working late, and I whispered, "Why?" But there was no answer, only silence and the sound of my own heartbeat, and I didn't follow Emily Harper, I didn't confront Emily Harper. I just sat there until Emily Harper drove away, and then I drove home like nothing had happened, repeating to myself, "It's nothing. Daniel Carter, it's nothing, even though deep down I knew it was everything. And when Emily Harper walked into the apartment later that night, tossing keys on the table like usual, Emily Harper smiled at me and said, "Hey, long day." And I looked at Emily Harper, really looked, searching for guilt, searching for anything, but all I saw was calm, and that hurt more than if Emily Harper had been nervous, so I forced a small smile and asked, "Long day?" And Emily Harper nodded, kicking off shoes. "Yeah, work was crazy," and I swallowed the truth sitting in my throat and said, "Yeah." I figured, because I couldn't bring myself to say what I saw, I couldn't shatter whatever this was, even if it was already broken. And Emily Harper walked past me like nothing was wrong, like nothing had changed, and I stood there thinking, how can Emily Harper act like this? But I didn't ask, I just followed the routine: dinner, small talk, silence, and later while sitting together, Emily Harper started talking about work again. "Victor Reynolds has been pushing everyone hard lately," and I froze for a second, just enough to feel it, just enough to notice it, and I asked casually, "Victor Reynolds again?" And Emily Harper shrugged. "Yeah, Daniel Carter, boss problems," and I nodded slowly, pretending it didn't matter. Sounds rough, but inside I was connecting things, small things like how often Victor Reynolds came up now, how natural it sounded when Emily Harper said that name, like it belonged in every conversation. And I told myself, it's just work, Daniel Carter, don't be stupid. But my mind didn't listen anymore. It kept replaying that image, that hotel, that moment, and the next few days I started noticing more, like how Emily Harper would step away to take calls, lowering voice slightly, or how messages would pop up and disappear quickly. And one evening I asked, trying to sound normal, "Who keeps texting this late?" And Emily Harper replied without looking up, "Just work stuff." And I nodded again, of course, because that was becoming my answer to everything. And later I told Marcus Reed about it, not everything, just pieces, and Marcus Reed looked at me like I was already too far gone and said, "Daniel Carter, this doesn't sound right." And I shook my head, "It's nothing, just work pressure." And Marcus Reed sighed, "You keep saying that, but you don't look like you believe it." And I forced a laugh. "I'm fine," even though I wasn't, even though something inside me had already started breaking, slowly, quietly, and every time Emily Harper said, "It's just work," I heard something else, something unspoken, something I didn't want to understand, but I did, and that was the worst part, because I wasn't discovering the truth anymore. I was recognizing it, piece by piece, lie by lie, moment by moment, until one thought finally settled in my mind, heavy and unavoidable. This isn't just work, and Daniel Carter already knows it. "I trust you," I said to Emily Harper that night, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt something inside me twist, because I wasn't sure if I was saying it to Emily Harper or trying to convince myself. And Emily Harper froze, just for a second, just a tiny pause. But I saw it, I felt it, and in that silence everything became louder than any confession ever could be. And Emily Harper quickly smiled after, like nothing had happened, saying, "Of course you trust me, Daniel Carter, why wouldn't you?" And I nodded slowly, forcing a calm tone. "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" Even though my chest felt tight, like I was holding something heavy that I refused to drop. And I could have asked right then, I could have said, "Daniel Carter saw Emily Harper at the hotel?" I could have demanded answers, but instead I just sat there, letting the moment pass, choosing silence over truth, because truth felt dangerous and silence felt safe, even if it was killing me slowly. And Emily Harper leaned back, scrolling through the phone again like nothing had changed, like that 1 second of hesitation never existed. And I watched quietly, thinking, say something, Daniel Carter, just ask. But I didn't. I just swallowed everything and said, "Long day tomorrow?" And Emily Harper replied casually, "Yeah, Victor Reynolds wants everyone early." And again that name landed heavy in my mind, but I didn't react. I just said, "Sounds like Victor Reynolds doesn't let anyone breathe." And Emily Harper laughed lightly. "That's how Victor Reynolds gets results." And I smiled faintly, hiding everything, because I didn't want to connect the dots out loud, even though they were already connected in my head. And later that night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing, replaying that pause again and again, whispering to myself, that wasn't nothing, that meant something. And my phone buzzed, and it was Marcus Reed, and I answered, trying to sound normal, "What's up?" And Marcus Reed immediately said, "Daniel Carter, something's off with you." And I leaned back in the chair, "I'm fine." And Marcus Reed sighed, "No, Daniel Carter isn't fine, I can hear it. What's going on with Emily Harper?" And I hesitated just for a moment, and that was enough for Marcus Reed to catch it. "See? That pause right there, Daniel Carter, that's not nothing." And I rubbed my face, frustrated. "It's just work stuff, nothing serious." And Marcus Reed didn't buy it. "Daniel Carter, stop lying, not to me, to yourself." And I stayed quiet for a second before saying, "I trust Emily Harper." And Marcus Reed replied sharply, "Do you?" And I didn't answer right away because I didn't know. Or maybe I did and I just didn't want to admit it. And Marcus Reed continued, Daniel Carter, trust doesn't make someone feel like this. You sound off. And I finally said, I just don't want to make a problem out of nothing. And Marcus Reed responded, or Daniel Carter doesn't want to face something that's already there. And that hit harder than I expected, so I got defensive. There's nothing to face. And Marcus Reed paused before saying quietly, then why does Daniel Carter sound like this? And I had no answer, just silence. And after the call ended, I sat there alone, staring at my reflection in the dark window, thinking, maybe Marcus Reed is right, maybe Daniel Carter is lying. But even then, I wasn't ready to admit it, because admitting it meant everything I had built with Emily Harper was already falling apart, and I wasn't ready to lose that. So the next morning, when Emily Harper smiled at me like everything was normal and said, you're quiet today, I shrugged, just tired. And Emily Harper nodded, same, work has been crazy, and I replied, yeah, I can tell. And Emily Harper didn't catch the meaning behind that, or maybe didn't care to, and as Emily Harper grabbed the keys and said, I'll be late again tonight, I forced another calm response, of course, and Emily Harper left without looking back, and I stood there in the silence thinking, say something, stop this. But I didn't. I just let Emily Harper walk out because deep down I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't just work. I knew Victor Reynolds wasn't just a boss anymore, but I chose not to say it. I chose not to ask. I chose not to fight, because as long as I stayed silent, I could pretend everything was still okay, and maybe that made me weak. Maybe that made me a coward, but in that moment all I wanted was to hold on to the life I thought I had, even if it was already slipping through my hands. I didn't plan to follow Emily Harper that night. I kept telling myself that as I drove behind Emily Harper's car, gripping the steering wheel like I was trying to control something already slipping out of my hands, whispering, turn around, Daniel Carter, just go home. But I didn't. I stayed right there, keeping just enough distance so Emily Harper wouldn't notice. My heart pounding harder with every turn until Emily Harper finally stopped outside a building I had never seen before, and I froze. When I recognized the name on the entrance quietly saying, Victor Reynolds, and my chest tightened instantly because that name wasn't supposed to be here, not like this, not at night, not outside a private apartment, and I watched as Emily Harper stepped out of the car, adjusting the jacket like nothing was wrong, like this was normal, and I whispered, please don't go inside, but Emily Harper did. Walking straight through the door without hesitation, without looking back, and that moment felt heavier than anything I had experienced before, like the last piece of doubt I was holding on to just disappeared, and I sat there in silence, staring at that door, waiting for something to happen, waiting for Emily Harper to walk back out and prove me wrong, and minutes passed, then more, until time itself felt meaningless, and I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes for a second, muttering, this isn't real, this isn't happening. But when I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed. The building was still there, the truth was still there, and I was still sitting in front of it like someone too afraid to face reality, and at some point I laughed quietly, a broken, empty laugh, saying, Daniel Carter already knew. Daniel Carter just didn't want to admit it, and I thought about calling Emily Harper just to hear the voice, just to ask, where are you? And listen to the lie one more time, but I didn't because I already knew what Emily Harper would say, I'm at work. And that thought made my chest ache even more, so I stayed silent, watching the building like it owed me answers, and hours passed, slowly dragging me deeper into something numb, something cold, until finally the door opened and Emily Harper walked out, and I sat up straight, my breath catching for a moment as I studied every detail, every movement, every expression, searching for guilt, searching for regret, searching for anything that could give me a reason to doubt what I was thinking, but Emily Harper looked calm, composed, almost relaxed. And that hurt more than anything else because it meant this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't confusion, this was something real, something chosen, and I whispered, how can Emily Harper look like that? And Emily Harper got into the car and drove away like it was just another night, like nothing had changed, but everything had changed, and I didn't follow this time. I just stayed there for a few seconds before starting my own car, driving in the opposite direction because I didn't want to see anything else. I didn't need to, I had already seen enough, and the entire drive home felt empty, like I wasn't even there. Like I was just moving through something I couldn't fully process yet, and when I finally stepped into the apartment, it felt different, quieter, heavier, like the space itself knew something had ended, and I stood there in the middle of the room looking around slowly, whispering, this isn't home anymore, and I sat down on the couch, leaning forward with my hands together, staring at the floor as everything replayed in my head again and again, Emily Harper walking in, the door closing, the hours passing, Emily Harper walking out like nothing mattered, and I kept asking myself, why didn't Daniel Carter stop Emily Harper? Why didn't Daniel Carter say anything? But I knew the answer because I didn't want to fight, I didn't want an explanation, I didn't want to hear the truth out loud because once it was spoken, there would be no going back, and a part of me was still holding on to something, even if it was already broken, and I heard the door open later when Emily Harper came back, footsteps soft, normal, like every other night, and Emily Harper called out, "Daniel Carter, you awake?" And I didn't move, I just stayed there, silent, and Emily Harper walked into the living room, stopping when Emily Harper saw me sitting there, asking casually, "Why are you sitting in the dark?" And I looked up slowly, forcing my voice to stay calm, just thinking, and Emily Harper shrugged, "You should sleep, Daniel Carter, tomorrow's going to be busy," and I nodded slightly, "Yeah, I know," and that was it, no questions, no confrontation, no anger, just silence, heavy and suffocating, and Emily Harper didn't notice anything different or maybe didn't care enough to notice, and as Emily Harper walked away toward the bedroom, I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes for a moment, whispering to myself, "It's over," not because I had ended it, not because I had said anything, but because something inside me had finally accepted what I had been avoiding for so long. And in that quiet, empty moment, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't suspicion anymore, this wasn't doubt, this was the truth, and Daniel Carter had just watched it happen with own eyes. "Where were you?" I asked Emily Harper, keeping my voice calm, steady, like nothing inside me was shaking, and Emily Harper didn't even look up right away, just slipped off shoes and answered casually, "Work," like it was the most normal thing in the world, like that single word could cover everything, and I nodded slowly, saying, "Yeah, of course." And that was it, that was the exact moment something inside me shifted completely, because I didn't feel confusion anymore, I didn't feel doubt, I didn't even feel the urge to question it, I just felt certain, and that certainty was colder than anything I had felt before because I realized I didn't need proof, I didn't need to check messages, I didn't need to follow Emily Harper again, I already had everything I needed, not in evidence, not in facts, but in the way Emily Harper spoke, in the way Emily Harper looked past me instead of at me, in the way work had become an answer for everything, and I sat there watching Emily Harper move around the apartment like nothing had changed, like I wasn't quietly falling apart right in front of Emily Harper, and Emily Harper said, "Why are you staring like that?" And I shook my head slightly, just thinking, and Emily Harper shrugged, walking into the kitchen, "You think too much, Daniel Carter?" And I let out a small breath, "Yeah, maybe," but inside I thought, Daniel Carter doesn't think too much. Daniel Carter just finally sees clearly, and Emily Harper kept talking about random things, about schedules, about Victor Reynolds pushing deadlines, about how stressful everything was, and I listened without really listening, nodding at the right moments, saying things like, "That sounds rough," and "Yeah, that's a lot," but none of it reached me anymore because my mind was already somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere detached, and at one point Emily Harper asked, "Are you even paying attention?" And I looked up, meeting Emily Harper eyes for a second before replying, "Yeah, I hear you," and Emily Harper frowned slightly, "You don't look like it," and I just smiled faintly, "I'm just tired," and Emily Harper accepted that without question, without concern, just like everything else, and that hurt in a different way because it meant Emily Harper didn't even notice the distance growing between us, or maybe didn't care enough to notice, and later that night, as we sat on opposite sides of the couch, Emily Harper scrolling through the phone again, I said quietly, "You've been really busy lately," and Emily Harper nodded without looking up, "Yeah, work's been insane," and I added, "With Victor Reynolds?" And Emily Harper paused for just a second before answering, "Yeah, who else?" And I leaned back slightly saying, "Right, who else?" And that was the last piece for me, not because of what Emily Harper said, but because of how naturally it came out, like there was nothing to hide, like there was no reason to even try, and I realized then that I had been the only one holding on to something, the only one pretending, the only one trying to keep this together, and I stopped, right there, in that moment. I stopped trying, I stopped questioning, I stopped hoping for honesty because hope had been the thing keeping me stuck, and without it, everything became simple, painfully simple, and Emily Harper suddenly looked over and asked, "Daniel Carter, are you okay?" And I met Emily Harper gaze, calm, steady, almost empty, and said, "Yeah, I'm fine," and for the first time I wasn't lying to Emily Harper because I wasn't okay in the way Emily Harper thought, but I was okay with the truth, I was okay with what I knew, and Emily Harper nodded, going back to the phone like that was enough, like that answer closed everything, and I sat there in silence thinking, this is it, this is where it ends, not out loud, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, internally, like a decision already made, and over the next few days I started pulling away. Without saying anything, I stopped asking questions, stopped starting conversations, stopped reacting to things that would have bothered me before, and Emily Harper didn't notice or didn't care, continuing with the same routines, the same excuses, the same distant tone, and one evening Emily Harper said, "You've been quiet lately," and I replied calmly, just focused on work, and Emily Harper nodded, same here. And that was it, no deeper questions, no concern, just surface level acknowledgement, and I realized then how easy it had become for both of us to exist without really seeing each other, and that realization didn't hurt the way I expected, it didn't break me, it just confirmed what I already knew, that whatever we had before was already gone, replaced by something empty, something performative, something neither of us was willing to confront, and I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, thinking, Daniel Carter doesn't need proof anymore. Daniel Carter already has the truth, and that truth wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't come with arguments or tears, it came quietly in small moments, in simple words like work, in pauses that lasted only seconds but meant everything, and as I opened my eyes again, looking at Emily Harper sitting there like nothing had changed, I realized the final part of it all, that Emily Harper wasn't the only one who had changed, I had too, because I was no longer waiting for answers, I was no longer hoping for honesty, I was just done, even if I hadn't said it out loud yet. I stayed, not because I still believed in what Emily Harper and I had, but because I needed time, and that was the part no one could see, not even Marcus Reed, because from the outside everything still looked the same, and that was exactly how I wanted it. So when Emily Harper walked into the apartment one evening and said, "Hey Daniel Carter, you're home early," I just smiled lightly and replied, "Yeah, finished work faster today," and Emily Harper nodded like nothing mattered, like nothing had changed, and that almost made it easier for me to play along because pretending became simple when the other person wasn't paying attention, and I followed the routine, sat down, asked, "How was work?" And Emily Harper replied, "Busy as always, Victor Reynolds has been pushing deadlines again," and I nodded, "Sounds exhausting, like I used to, like I cared the same way, but inside I was already detached, already somewhere else, thinking about numbers, plans, timing, and I realized that staying wasn't about Emily Harper anymore, it was about control, about leaving on my own terms, without chaos, without questions, without giving anything away. And later that night, when Marcus Reed called, I stepped outside, leaning against the wall as I answered, "What's up?" And Marcus Reed didn't waste time, "Daniel Carter, why are you still there?" And I closed my eyes for a second before replying, "Because I'm not ready yet." And Marcus Reed sounded frustrated, "Not ready for what?" "Daniel Carter already knows what's going on," and I exhaled slowly, "Yeah, Daniel Carter knows," and Marcus Reed pushed harder, "Then why stay?" And I said quietly, "Because leaving right now would be messy and Daniel Carter doesn't want that," and Marcus Reed paused before saying, "Or maybe Daniel Carter is scared," and I shook my head slightly, "No. Daniel Carter just wants to do this right," and Marcus Reed sighed, "You're overthinking this, man, just leave," and I responded calmly, "Not yet." And that was the truth, simple and final, because I needed time to process everything, to prepare, to detach completely before walking away, and after the call ended I stood there for a moment thinking, Daniel Carter is already gone. This is just the part where everything catches up. And when I went back inside, Emily Harper was sitting on the couch, scrolling again, barely glancing up as Emily Harper asked, "Who was that?" And I replied casually, "Marcus Reed," and Emily Harper nodded, "Tell Marcus Reed I said hi," and I smiled faintly, "Yeah, sure," even though I knew that conversation didn't matter anymore, and I sat beside Emily Harper, close enough to look normal, distant enough to feel nothing, and Emily Harper started talking about something random, about work schedules, about a meeting, about Victor Reynolds again, and I listened, or at least I pretended to, saying things like, "That makes sense," and "Yeah, that's a lot," but none of it reached me because my mind was focused on something else entirely, like finding a new place, saving money quietly, planning an exit that wouldn't leave anything behind. And at one point Emily Harper asked, "You're really quiet lately, Daniel Carter?" And I looked over, meeting Emily Harper's eyes with a calm expression, "Just tired?" And Emily Harper accepted it immediately. "Yeah, same," and went back to the phone, and that moment confirmed everything for me because there was no effort, no curiosity, no concern, just acceptance of distance, and I thought, this is easier than Daniel Carter expected. And over the next few days I kept playing the same role, smiling when needed, talking when necessary, existing without really being present, and Emily Harper didn't question it, didn't notice the shift or didn't care enough to, and that gave me the space I needed to prepare everything quietly. And one evening Marcus Reed texted, "You still there?" And I replied, "For now," and Marcus Reed sent back, "Don't wait too long," and I stared at that message before typing, "I won't," because I knew this wasn't about staying anymore, it was about leaving the right way. And as I sat there next to Emily Harper, who was still living like everything was fine, I realized something clearly, that pretending wasn't weakness, it was strategy, and every normal conversation, every forced smile, every quiet moment was just another step toward the end, And even though Emily Harper didn't see it, didn't feel it, didn't understand it, I knew exactly what I was doing because I wasn't staying to fix anything, I wasn't staying to fight, I was staying to finish what had already ended on my own terms in my own time. I didn't go looking for anything that night. I kept telling myself that as I sat on the couch while Emily Harper was in the shower, the quiet sound of running water filling the apartment, and everything felt normal, almost too normal, until the phone lit up on the table beside me, and my eyes moved without thinking, without permission, landing on the screen, and for a second I froze, whispering under my breath, "Don't do this, Daniel Carter," but it was already too late because I had seen the name Victor Reynolds, clear and undeniable, and beneath it just a few words that hit harder than anything else. "Miss you already?" And my chest tightened instantly, my fingers twitching like I was about to pick up the phone, but I stopped myself, forcing my hands to stay still as I repeated quietly, "No. Daniel Carter doesn't need more," because that message alone was enough, more than enough, and I sat there staring at it for a second longer before carefully placing the phone back exactly where it was, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just crossed the line I had been avoiding for so long, and my hands were shaking slightly, but I kept my breathing steady, telling myself, "Stay calm, don't react." And when Emily Harper walked out of the bathroom, drying hair, smiling casually, asking, "Why are you sitting so still?" I looked up and replied normally, "Just tired?" And Emily Harper nodded, "Yeah, me too," like that was all there was to it, like nothing had changed, and I watched Emily Harper pick up the phone, checking the screen for a second before setting it down again without saying anything, without reacting, and I thought, of course, why would Emily Harper react? And that thought didn't hurt the way it used to, it just settled into something cold and final, and Emily Harper sat beside me, close enough to touch, but it felt like miles apart, and Emily Harper said, "Long day tomorrow again?" And I replied, "Yeah," keeping my voice steady, and Emily Harper added, "Victor Reynolds scheduled another early meeting?" And I nodded slightly, of course Victor Reynolds did, and Emily Harper didn't catch the tone, didn't question it, just leaned back, scrolling again like everything was normal, and I sat there in silence, my mind replaying that message over and over, not because I needed confirmation anymore, but because it was the final piece, the one thing that removed any remaining doubt. And later when we went to bed, Emily Harper turned away almost immediately, falling asleep quickly like always, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, wide awake, feeling something settle deep inside me, not anger, not sadness, just clarity, and I whispered softly to myself, "That's it. Daniel Carter doesn't need anything else." And I thought about everything, the hotel, the lies, the distance, the name Victor Reynolds showing up again and again, and now the message, simple and direct, and I realized how obvious it all had been, how much I had ignored, how many chances I had given to something that was already gone, and I turned my head slightly, looking at Emily Harper sleeping peacefully, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to wake Emily Harper up, didn't feel the need to ask questions or demand answers, because what would be the point? I already knew everything that mattered, and I said quietly, almost like a final acknowledgement, "Daniel Carter is done," not out loud to Emily Harper but to myself, because that was the only person who needed to hear it, and the rest of the night passed slowly, every minute stretching as I lay there awake, thinking about what came next, about how I would leave, about how I would finish this without noise, without confrontation, without giving Emily Harper the chance to explain or justify anything, because explanations didn't matter anymore, and at some point I sat up slightly, running a hand through my hair, whispering, "No more questions, no more waiting," and that decision felt heavier than anything before, but also strangely calm, like everything had finally settled into place. And when morning came, Emily Harper stretched slightly, turning toward me and saying, "You didn't sleep, did you?" And I looked at Emily Harper, calm, steady, and replied, "No. Daniel Carter didn't." And Emily Harper frowned a little, "Why?" And I gave a simple answer, "Just thinking," and Emily Harper nodded, "You think too much." And I almost smiled at that, but there was nothing left behind it, no emotion, no attachment, just quiet understanding, because this time, Daniel Carter wasn't overthinking, Daniel Carter was finally seeing everything exactly as it was, and there was no going back from that. "I'm done," I whispered to myself that morning, standing alone in the kitchen while Emily Harper was still in the bedroom, and the words didn't feel heavy or dramatic, they felt calm, almost quiet, like something that had already been decided long before I finally said it out loud, and I leaned against the counter, repeating softly, "Daniel Carter is done," not angry, not broken, just certain. And when Emily Harper walked in a few minutes later, stretching slightly and saying, "Morning, you're up early," I just nodded, "Yeah, couldn't sleep," and Emily Harper poured coffee like nothing had changed, like everything between us was still the same, asking casually, "You okay?" And I replied simply, "I'm fine," And for the first time that answer wasn't a lie because I wasn't okay in the way Emily Harper thought, but I was okay with the decision I had made and Emily Harper didn't press further, just nodded and moved on, and that was when I realized something clearly, that I didn't need to confront Emily Harper anymore. I didn't need answers, I didn't need explanations because none of it would change what I already knew, and over the next few days I stopped trying in ways that were almost invisible. I stopped asking about work, stopped reacting when Victor Reynolds came up, stopped caring when Emily Harper said, "I'll be late again," and instead I just replied, "Okay." And Emily Harper didn't question it, didn't notice the shift, or maybe didn't care enough to notice, and that silence between us started growing, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt controlled, like something I was choosing instead of something happening to me. And one evening Emily Harper asked, "Why are you so quiet lately, Daniel Carter?" And I shrugged slightly, just focusing on work, and Emily Harper accepted it immediately. "Yeah, same here," and that was it. No deeper conversation, no curiosity, just surface-level answers that matched the distance we were both living in. And later that week, I met Sophie Carter, sitting across from Sophie Carter at a small cafe, and Sophie Carter looked at me carefully before saying, "Daniel Carter looks different," and I forced a small smile. "Different how?" And Sophie Carter leaned forward slightly, studying my face. "Empty?" And I paused for a second before replying, "That's one way to put it." And Sophie Carter didn't smile back, just said softly, "What's going on with Emily Harper?" And I looked down at the table for a moment before answering, "Nothing, and everything." And Sophie Carter frowned, "That doesn't make sense." And I let out a quiet breath, "It does to Daniel Carter." And Sophie Carter shook head slightly, "Daniel Carter isn't talking like normal, what happened?" And I stayed silent for a second before saying, "Daniel Carter just stopped caring." And Sophie Carter's expression shifted, concern mixing with something else. "You don't just stop caring about someone like that." And I met Sophie Carter eyes calmly. Daniel Carter didn't stop suddenly. Daniel Carter just stopped pretending. And Sophie Carter leaned back slightly, processing that, then asked, "Did Emily Harper do something?" And I hesitated for a moment before replying, "It doesn't matter anymore." And Sophie Carter said quietly, "It matters to Daniel Carter." And I shook head, "Not anymore, not in the way it used to." And Sophie Carter looked at me carefully. "Daniel Carter doesn't look heartbroken." And I nodded slightly, "Because Daniel Carter isn't." And Sophie Carter frowned, "Then what is this?" And I answered simply, "It's nothing," then corrected myself, "No, it's everything, just without the emotion." And Sophie Carter stayed quiet for a moment before saying softly, "That's worse." And I didn't argue because I knew Sophie Carter was right. It was worse in a way because heartbreak meant something still mattered, but this was numbness, this was clarity without feeling. And as I sat there, I realized that the decision I had made wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't something I needed to announce, it was quiet, controlled, final. And when Sophie Carter finally said, "So what are you going to do?" I looked up calmly and replied, "Daniel Carter is going to leave." And Sophie Carter asked, "When?" And I shook head slightly, "Soon, just not yet." And Sophie Carter nodded slowly, "Just don't wait too long." And I replied, "I won't." And as I walked away later, I repeated the same words in my mind, "I'm done." Not to Emily Harper, not to anyone else, just to myself, because that was all that mattered now. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel like weakness, it felt like control. I stopped thinking about Emily Harper as part of my future and started thinking about myself instead, and that shift was quiet but powerful because everything I did from that moment had purpose. So when Lena Brooks looked at me one afternoon at work and said, "Daniel Carter, something's different about you," I didn't deny it, I just leaned back in my chair and replied, "Yeah, I had to change." And Lena Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Had to? That sounds serious." And I shrugged slightly, "It is," keeping my tone calm, controlled. And Lena Brooks studied me for a second before asking, "Is this about Emily Harper?" And I paused just long enough to acknowledge it before saying, "It's about Daniel Carter now." And Lena Brooks nodded slowly, "That's new." And I gave a faint smile. "Yeah, it is," because for the first time I wasn't lying or hiding behind excuses, I was just stating a fact. And over the next few days I started putting everything into motion, not emotionally, not impulsively, but carefully, like building something step by step. And Marcus Reed noticed it too when I met him one evening, and Marcus Reed said, "You look different, but not in a bad way." And I replied, "Daniel Carter is just focused." And Marcus Reed smirked slightly, "Focused on what?" And I answered simply, "Leaving." And Marcus Reed leaned forward, "So it's finally happening?" And I nodded, "Yeah, just not loudly." And Marcus Reed let out a small breath, "About time." And I added, "Daniel Carter doesn't want drama." And Marcus Reed said, "You're planning this like a mission?" and I gave a slight nod. Because it is? And that was the truth, because every move I made had intention, every decision was part of something bigger, and I started with the basics, checking finances, cutting unnecessary expenses, making sure everything was stable before I took the next step. And one afternoon I walked into a leasing office, speaking calmly to the agent, saying, "Daniel Carter is looking for a one-bedroom apartment, something quiet." And the agent smiled politely. "We have a few options, what's your timeline?" And I replied without hesitation, "Soon," because that word carried everything I wasn't saying out loud, and as I looked through options I felt something strange, not sadness, not hesitation, just clarity, like I was finally moving in the right direction. And later that night when I got home, Emily Harper was already there, sitting on the couch, and Emily Harper said, "You're late," and I responded casually, "Had some things to take care of," and Emily Harper nodded, "Work?" And I said, "Something like that," because explaining anything felt unnecessary now, and Emily Harper didn't question it, just went back to the phone, and I stood there for a second thinking, this is exactly why Daniel Carter can do this quietly, because nothing I did raised suspicion, nothing I changed made a difference to Emily Harper. And over time I started adjusting my routine, spending more time out, focusing on work, building something separate from what we had, and Lena Brooks noticed again one day saying, "Daniel Carter is working more than usual," and I replied, "Trying to build something," and Lena Brooks smiled slightly, "That sounds like growth," and I nodded, "It is," and Marcus Reed kept checking in, asking, "How's the plan going?" And I answered, "Almost ready," and Marcus Reed said, "You're really doing this without telling Emily Harper anything?" And I replied calmly, "There's nothing left to say," and Marcus Reed didn't argue, just nodded, "Fair enough." And as the days passed, everything started aligning, finances stable, apartment secured, routine adjusted. And one evening I stood alone in the new place, empty but full of potential, whispering to myself, "This is it." And that moment felt more powerful than any confrontation could have been, because I wasn't reacting anymore, I was acting. And when I returned to the apartment I still shared with Emily Harper, everything felt even more distant, even more temporary, and Emily Harper said casually, "You've been busy lately," and I replied, "Yeah, just working on things," and Emily Harper nodded, "Good, that's important." And I almost laughed at how simple that sounded, because Emily Harper had no idea what those things really were, and I sat down, looking around the space one more time, realizing that I had already left in every way that mattered, and the rest was just timing, just execution. And as I leaned back I thought quietly, this isn't revenge in the way people expect. This is something better, because I wasn't breaking anything, I wasn't creating chaos, I was simply walking away stronger, clearer, and completely in control, and that control became my answer, my closure, my way out. Emily Harper didn't notice anything, and that was the part that stayed with me the most, because I could sit right there across from Emily Harper, nodding at the right moments, replying when needed, and still feel completely gone, like I had already stepped out of something Emily Harper was still pretending existed. So when Emily Harper said one evening, "You've been quiet again, Daniel Carter," I just shrugged lightly and replied, "Just a long day," and Emily Harper nodded, "Same here, Victor. Reynolds has been pushing everyone non-stop," and I said, "Yeah, sounds like Victor Reynolds," like I always did, like nothing had changed. And Emily Harper kept going, talking about meetings, deadlines, small frustrations, and I sat there listening, or at least appearing to listen, saying things like, "That makes sense," and "That sounds exhausting," but inside I was somewhere else entirely, thinking about my plans, my timing, my exit. And at one point Emily Harper smiled slightly and said, "You're easy to talk to, you know that?" And I almost laughed at that, but instead I just nodded, "Yeah," because the truth was I wasn't talking anymore, I was just playing a role. And Emily Harper didn't notice the difference, didn't see that the conversations were one-sided now, didn't feel that the connection had already faded, and that realization hit me in a way the betrayal hadn't, because betrayal meant something had been broken, but this meant something had been erased. And later that night, when we sat on the couch, Emily Harper scrolling through the phone and occasionally glancing at me, asking, "Did you hear what I said?" I replied calmly, "Yeah, about the meeting tomorrow," and Emily Harper smiled, "See, you are listening," and I nodded slightly, of course, even though I hadn't really been paying attention, just catching enough to respond, just enough to keep the illusion alive. And Emily Harper leaned back comfortably, like everything was normal, like we were still what we used to be, and I thought quietly, how can Emily Harper not see this? But then I answered myself just as quickly, because Emily Harper isn't looking, and that hurt more than anything else, not because I needed Emily Harper to notice, but because it showed how little presence I had in Emily Harper's world now. And the next morning, Emily Harper said casually, "I might be late again tonight," and I replied, "Okay, without even looking up, and Emily Harper paused slightly before saying, "That's it?" And I glanced up briefly. "What do you mean?" And Emily Harper shrugged. "Nothing, just, you don't ask anymore." And I gave a faint smile. "There's nothing to ask." And Emily Harper accepted that without questioning further, just nodded, "Yeah, I guess," and walked away. And I sat there thinking, even when Daniel Carter stops asking, Emily Harper still doesn't see it, and that made everything clearer because it meant this wasn't just about lies or secrets anymore, it was about absence, about being invisible in a space I used to belong in. And later that day Marcus Reed called and asked, "How's it going over there?" And I replied, "Quiet," and Marcus Reed said, "Quiet can be dangerous," and I shook my head slightly even though Marcus Reed couldn't see it, "Not this kind of quiet." And Marcus Reed paused before asking, "What kind is it then?" And I answered simply, "The kind where it's already over but no one has said it yet." And Marcus Reed let out a small breath. "That sounds worse than a fight." And I replied, "It is. Because fights mean something is still alive, still worth arguing over, but this silence meant everything had already ended without a single word, and that was the part Emily Harper didn't notice, didn't feel, didn't question. And when I returned home that evening, Emily Harper was sitting in the same spot, phone in hand, saying, "You're home?" And I replied, "Yeah." And Emily Harper asked, "How was work?" And I said, "Good." And that was it, short answers, simple exchanges, nothing meaningful, nothing real, and Emily Harper didn't push for more, didn't try to fill the gap. Just continued as if everything was fine. And I sat there thinking, this is what it looks like when something ends quietly, and for the first time I didn't feel angry about it, didn't feel hurt in the same way, I just felt distant, like I was watching something from the outside, something that used to matter but didn't anymore. And as I leaned back, listening to Emily Harper talk about another day, another meeting, another moment that didn't include me, I realized the truth I hadn't said out loud yet, that I wasn't just preparing to leave physically, I had already left in every way that mattered, and Emily Harper still hadn't noticed. Rachel Evans didn't mean to say it, I could tell that immediately from the way Rachel Evans froze after the words slipped out, but it didn't matter because once something like that is said, it can't be taken back. And we were standing near the office break area when Rachel Evans looked at me and asked casually, "Daniel Carter, you know about Victor Reynolds, right?" And I didn't react the way Rachel Evans expected. I didn't act confused or surprised, I just looked straight at Rachel Evans and said calmly, "Yeah." And that single word changed everything in that moment because Rachel Evans' expression shifted instantly, eyes widening slightly, lips parting like Rachel Evans had said too much. And then Rachel Evans went quiet, completely silent, and I could feel the weight of that silence settling between us, confirming more than any explanation ever could. And Rachel Evans finally said, I thought you already knew everything." And I nodded slightly. "Daniel Carter does?" And Rachel Evans looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly before asking, "Then why haven't you said anything?" And I shrugged, keeping my tone steady. "What's the point?" And Rachel Evans frowned. "The point is, that's not okay." And I let out a small breath. "Daniel Carter knows it's not okay." And Rachel Evans hesitated again before saying softly, "Emily Harper didn't mean for it to get like this." And I looked at Rachel Evans for a second, not angry, not emotional, just calm, and replied, "It doesn't matter how it started." And Rachel Evans stayed quiet after that, like there was nothing left to say, and honestly there wasn't, because whatever explanation Rachel Evans could have given wouldn't change anything. And as I walked away from that conversation, I realized something important, not that I had learned anything new, but that hearing it from someone else made it real in a different way. Heavier, more solid, like the final piece of something I had already accepted internally. And later that day Marcus Reed called and asked, "What happened?" And I said, "Rachel Evans confirmed it." And Marcus Reed went quiet for a second before saying, "So that's it then?" And I replied calmly, "It's been it for a while." And Marcus Reed let out a slow breath. "You okay?" And I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Daniel Carter is fine." And Marcus Reed said, "You don't sound fine." And I responded, "Daniel Carter isn't hurt anymore." And Marcus Reed paused. "Then what is this?" And I answered simply, "Clarity." And Marcus Reed didn't argue with that, just said quietly, "What are you going to do?" And I replied, "Nothing different." And Marcus Reed sounded surprised. "You're not going to confront Emily Harper?" And I shook my head even though Marcus Reed couldn't see it. "No." And Marcus Reed asked, "Why not?" And I answered calmly, "Because there's nothing left to say." And that was the truth, because confrontation requires emotion, requires a need for answers or closure, and I didn't need any of that anymore. And when I got home that evening, Emily Harper was sitting on the couch like always, looking up briefly and saying, "You're late?" And I replied, "Had things to handle?" And Emily Harper nodded, "Work?" And I said, "Something like that." And Emily Harper went back to the phone without another question, without noticing anything different, and I sat down. Across from Emily Harper, watching quietly as Emily Harper talked about the day, about meetings, about Victor Reynolds again, like the name didn't carry any weight, like it was just another part of life, and I responded when needed, "That sounds busy, and yeah, I get that," keeping everything calm, controlled, distant, and at one point Emily Harper asked, "Daniel Carter, are you even listening?" And I looked up, meeting Emily Harper's eyes briefly before saying, "Yeah," and Emily Harper smiled. Slightly, "Good," and went back to talking, and I realized then just how far I had come from where I started, because before, I would have needed to confront, to ask, to demand the truth, but now I didn't feel anything like that, just a quiet understanding that everything had already ended, and that this conversation, this space, this version of us was just something temporary, something already fading, and as I leaned back, listening to Emily Harper talk without really hearing the words, I thought quietly, Daniel Carter doesn't need proof anymore, but now Daniel Carter has it anyway. And instead of anger or sadness, all I felt was confirmation, steady and final, like the last piece of something I had already decided to leave behind, and in that moment I knew for sure, not just in my mind but completely, that there was nothing left here for me, nothing worth holding on to, nothing worth confronting, just something to walk away from, quietly, completely, and without looking back. I didn't leave all at once, I couldn't, because this wasn't something loud or sudden, this was something quiet, controlled, and deliberate, so I started small, picking up pieces of my life one at a time and moving them out without making a scene, without giving Emily Harper a reason to ask questions. And the first time I packed a bag, just a few clothes, nothing obvious, Emily Harper was sitting on the couch scrolling through the phone, and Emily Harper glanced up briefly and said, "You going somewhere?" And I replied casually, "Just taking some stuff to Marcus Reed, Daniel Carter left it there last time," and Emily Harper nodded without hesitation, "Oh, okay," and went right back to the phone, and that was it, no follow-up, no curiosity, just acceptance. And as I walked out of the apartment carrying that small bag, I thought quietly, that was easier than Daniel Carter expected. And when I reached Marcus Reed's place, Marcus Reed opened the door, looked at the bag, then looked at me, and said, "You started?" And I nodded, "Yes," slowly, and Marcus Reed stepped aside, "Come in," and as I walked in, Marcus Reed added, "You're really doing this piece by piece?" And I set the bag down, replying, "That's the plan." And Marcus Reed shook head slightly, "Emily Harper hasn't noticed?" And I gave a faint, almost empty smile, "No," or "Emily Harper doesn't care," and Marcus Reed sighed, "That's messed up." And I shrugged, "It makes things easier," and over the next few days I repeated the same process, taking small things Emily Harper wouldn't immediately notice, a jacket, a pair of shoes, a few personal items, and every time I walked out with something, Emily Harper either didn't see or didn't question it, and one evening Emily Harper said, "You've been out a lot lately," and I replied, "Just busy," and Emily Harper nodded, "Same here," and that was enough for Emily Harper, enough to stop the conversation, enough to avoid looking deeper, and each time I packed something, I felt it, not in a dramatic way, not like a sudden wave of emotion, but like a quiet acknowledgement, like closing a door slowly instead of slamming it, and I would sit for a second holding an item, thinking, Daniel Carter used to care about this place, about this life. And then I would pack it anyway because caring wasn't enough to stay anymore, and one night as I folded a shirt, Emily Harper walked into the room and asked, "What are you doing?" And I replied, without hesitation, "Just organizing some stuff," and Emily Harper leaned against the doorframe watching for a second before saying, "You've been doing that a lot," and I nodded, "Yeah, trying to clean things up," and Emily Harper shrugged, "That's good, Daniel Carter should have done that earlier," and I almost laughed at how simple that sounded because Emily Harper had no idea what cleaning things up really meant, and after Emily Harper left the room, I sat there for a moment, holding that shirt, whispering softly, "This is it," not as a question, not as doubt, but as confirmation, and when I packed it away, it felt like something final, something that couldn't be undone, and Marcus Reed kept asking, "How much is left?" And I would reply, "Not much," and Marcus Reed would say, "You sure you don't want to just end it already?" And I answered calmly, "Soon," because I needed it to happen this way, step by step, without chaos, without confrontation, and as the apartment slowly became less mine, less filled with my presence, I noticed something strange, not in Emily Harper but in myself. I felt lighter, like each item I removed wasn't just a thing, it was a piece of something I no longer needed to carry, and one evening as I sat on the couch next to Emily Harper, who was talking about another long day, another meeting with Victor Reynolds, I looked around quietly and realized how little of me was left there, and Emily Harper didn't notice, didn't feel the difference. Just continued talking, asking, "Daniel Carter, are you listening?" And I replied, "Yeah, Even though I wasn't really there anymore, not in the way that mattered, and as I leaned back I thought to myself, this is the beginning of the end, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain, because every item I moved, every step I took, was leading to one thing, a goodbye that Emily Harper didn't even know was already happening. I stood in the apartment one last time, and it didn't feel like mine anymore, not because the furniture was gone or the space looked different, but because everything that once made it feel like home had already disappeared long before I packed the final bag, and I looked around slowly, taking in the quiet, whispering under my breath, "This is it, Daniel Carter," and for a moment I just stood there, hands in my pockets, letting the silence settle in, because this wasn't about anger or regret. Anymore, it was about finality, and Emily Harper wasn't there, which somehow made it easier because I didn't have to see Emily Harper's face, didn't have to hear another casual conversation that meant nothing, and I walked into the living room, glancing at the couch where we used to sit, where Emily Harper would talk about work, about Victor Reynolds, about everything except what mattered, and I said quietly, "It ended a long time ago," and then I moved toward the kitchen, stopping briefly as I remembered the mornings that felt normal, the ones where I still believed everything was real, and I let out a small breath. Daniel Carter held on to something that wasn't there, and I didn't feel sad saying it, just aware, just clear, and I walked back to the table, pulling out a piece of paper and a pen, sitting down slowly as I stared at the blank page for a second, not because I didn't know what to write, but because I knew exactly what needed to be said and nothing more, and I whispered, "No explanations, no arguments," and then I wrote it, simple and direct, "I know. I'm done." And I stared at those words for a moment, reading them again, not searching for emotion, not questioning anything, just confirming that this was enough, because it said everything without needing anything else, and I placed the note on the table where Emily Harper would see it, making sure it was visible but not dramatic, just there, quiet, like everything else had been, and as I stood up, I looked around one more time, letting my eyes move across the room slowly, and I said, softly, "Goodbye." Not to Emily Harper, not even to the place, but to the version of myself that had stayed too long, that had ignored the truth, that had waited for something that was never going to change, and I picked up my last bag, heading toward the door, pausing for a second with my hand on the handle, thinking, this is the moment, and for a brief second I wondered if I should wait, if I should say something in person, if I should give Emily Harper a chance to speak, to explain, to react, but that thought faded just as quickly as it came, because I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need closure from Emily Harper. I had already found it within myself, and I opened the door, stepping out without hesitation, without looking back, and as the door closed behind me, I felt it, not a rush of emotion, not relief or sadness, just a quiet sense of completion, like something had finally ended the way it was supposed to, and as I walked down the hallway, I pulled out my phone, seeing a message from Marcus Reed that read, "Today?" And I replied simply, "Yeah." And Marcus Reed responded almost instantly, "You okay?" And I looked ahead, steady, calm, and typed, "Daniel Carter is fine," because that was the truth. I wasn't broken, I wasn't angry, I was just done, and as I stepped outside into the open air, I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything I had carried finally lift, and I said quietly to myself, "No more," because there was nothing left to hold on to. Nothing left to question, nothing left to say, and somewhere behind me in that apartment, the note sat waiting, simple and final, holding the last words I would ever leave for Emily Harper, and that was enough, more than enough, because this time silence wasn't weakness, it was my answer. My phone started ringing before I even reached the end of the street, and I already knew who it was without looking, because there was only one person who would call like that, over and over, without stopping, and I pulled the phone out slowly, staring at the screen as Emily Harper's name flashed again and again, and I let it ring, whispering quietly to myself, "Not this time," because for once I wasn't going to pick up. I wasn't going to explain, I wasn't going to give Emily Harper access to anything I had already taken back, and the call ended, only for another one to start immediately, and I shook my head slightly, muttering, "Too late," as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, continuing to walk without slowing down, without turning around, and when the calls finally stopped, I thought maybe that was it, maybe Emily Harper understood, but then the phone buzzed again, this time a message, and I stopped for a second, pulling it out and reading the words on the screen, "Can we talk?" And I stared at that message longer than I expected, not because I was tempted, but because of how simple it was, how normal it sounded, like everything that had happened could be fixed with a conversation. And I let out a quiet breath, saying under my breath, "Talk about what?" Because there was nothing left to say, nothing that hadn't already been answered in silence, and for a brief second I imagined replying, imagined writing something back like, "There's nothing to talk about," or, "It's over." But I didn't, because even that felt unnecessary, and instead I just stood there, holding the phone, reading the message again, letting the weight of it pass through me without reacting, and then I deleted it just like that, no hesitation, no second thought, and as the screen went blank I felt something shift inside me, something small but important, and I whispered, Daniel Carter chose Daniel Carter. Because that's what this was, not revenge, not anger, just a choice, and I started walking again, slower this time, calmer, as if something had finally settled into place, and a few minutes later the phone buzzed again, another call, and I didn't even take it out this time, I just let it ring in my pocket until it stopped, and I kept moving forward, thinking, Emily Harper is going to keep trying, and maybe Emily Harper would, maybe there would be more calls, more messages, more attempts to pull me back into something I had already left, but none of that mattered anymore because I had already made my decision. And later that evening Marcus Reed called, and this time I answered, hearing Marcus Reed's voice immediately. You left, didn't you? And I replied calmly, yeah. And Marcus Reed asked, Emily Harper called me asking where you are, and I let out a small breath. Daniel Carter didn't tell Marcus Reed anything, and Marcus Reed said, I figured, then paused before asking, you okay? And I looked ahead, steady, Daniel Carter is fine, and Marcus Reed didn't push further, just said, good, you did the right thing, and I nodded slightly even though Marcus Reed couldn't see it. Yeah, and after the call ended I sat down on a bench nearby, pulling out my phone again, not to check messages, but just to hold it for a second, thinking about how different everything felt now, because before, every call from Emily Harper would have mattered, every message would have pulled me back, every "can we talk?" would have made me stop and reconsider, but now it didn't. Now it was just noise, something distant, something I no longer belonged to, and I said quietly to myself, this is what moving on feels like. Not dramatic, not emotional, just clear, just steady. And as I put the phone away again I realized something I hadn't fully understood before, that walking away wasn't just about leaving a place or a person, it was about refusing to go back. Refusing to reopen something that had already ended, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to check if Emily Harper had called again, didn't feel the need to see if there were more messages waiting, because it didn't matter, none of it did anymore. And as I stood up, continuing down the street, I whispered one last thing, not out of anger, not out of sadness, but out of certainty. No more conversations, no more chances, because this time I wasn't choosing Emily Harper, I was choosing myself, and that was enough. My phone buzzed again that afternoon, and I didn't need to check it to know it was Emily Harper, but this time it wasn't just calls, it was something different, something heavier, because when I finally looked at the screen, there was a voicemail notification, and I stared at it for a second before pressing play, hearing Emily Harper's voice come through, shaky, unfamiliar, saying, Daniel Carter, please just listen. I made a mistake, and I stood there quietly, letting those words settle, not reacting, not interrupting, just listening as Emily Harper continued, Victor Reynolds, everything is falling apart, there are problems at work, people are talking, and Daniel Carter didn't know how bad it was. I didn't know how bad it would get, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I had already accepted. And Emily Harper's voice cracked slightly as Emily Harper said, I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have risked everything, and I let out a slow breath, whispering to myself, too late. As the voicemail continued, can we just talk, please, Daniel Carter? And when it ended I didn't replay it, didn't sit there analyzing every word, I just locked the phone and stood still for a second. And Marcus Reed called shortly after, saying immediately, you heard from Emily Harper, didn't you? And I replied calmly, yeah. And Marcus Reed asked, what happened? And I said, everything is collapsing on Victor Reynolds' side. And Marcus Reed let out a low whistle. I heard something about that too, business issues, investors pulling out, and Victor Reynolds' father is stepping in. And I nodded slightly even though Marcus Reed couldn't see it. That sounds right. And Marcus Reed added, and Emily Harper is caught in the middle of all that? And I answered simply, yeah. And Marcus Reed paused before asking, you feel anything about it? And I thought about that question for a moment before replying, no. And Marcus Reed sounded surprised, nothing at all? And I shook my head slightly, Daniel Carter already went through all of it, this part isn't for Daniel Carter anymore. And Marcus Reed stayed quiet for a second before saying, that's cold? And I responded calmly, no, it's clear, because there was a difference and I could feel it. This wasn't about revenge, wasn't about watching someone fall, it was just distance. And later that evening another message came through, not a call this time, just text, and I looked at it without opening it right away, knowing exactly what it would say. And when I finally did, it read, Daniel Carter, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I was confused, I was stupid, please just give me a chance to explain. And I stared at those words for a moment, remembering how many times I had waited for honesty, for clarity, for even a small acknowledgement, and now that it was finally there, it didn't matter anymore. And I whispered quietly, this isn't for Daniel Carter, before locking the phone again, and I sat down thinking about everything Marcus Reed had said about Victor Reynolds losing control, about pressure from family, about rumors spreading, and I realized something simple but important, that I didn't need to do anything, didn't need to confront, didn't need to expose anything, because everything was already happening on its own. And Marcus Reed texted later, "You going to respond?" And I typed back, "No," and Marcus Reed replied, "You're just going to let it all play out?" And I answered, "Yeah," because that was enough, because whatever consequences were coming, they didn't need my involvement, didn't need my voice. And as I leaned back, I thought about Emily Harper's words, "I made a mistake," and I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, didn't feel validation, just a quiet understanding that some realizations come too late to change anything. And I said softly to myself, "Karma doesn't need Daniel Carter help," because it didn't. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion, and for the first time I wasn't part of that story anymore. I was just someone who had already walked away, someone who didn't need answers, didn't need apologies, didn't need anything from them. And as my phone buzzed one more time, another message waiting, I didn't even check it, I just left it there, untouched. Because whatever was happening on the other side of that screen, it wasn't my world anymore. I sat across from Dr. Hayes for the first time, not knowing what to expect, and Dr. Hayes looked at me calmly before saying, "So, Daniel Carter, what brings Daniel Carter here?" And I leaned back slightly, answering honestly, "Daniel Carter walked away from something, and now Daniel Carter doesn't know what comes next." And Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, "That's more common than Daniel Carter thinks," and I let out a quiet breath. "It doesn't feel common," and Dr. Hayes smiled faintly, "Of course not. Because it's personal." And that simple response made something shift in me, because for once I wasn't explaining myself to defend anything, I was just talking. And Dr. Hayes continued, "Do you feel like Daniel Carter lost something important?" And I paused for a moment before answering, "Daniel Carter thought so at first," and Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, "And now?" And I looked down briefly, then back up. "Now it feels like Daniel Carter lost something that wasn't real anymore." And Dr. Hayes nodded, "That's clarity, not loss." And I repeated quietly, "Clarity," letting the word settle. And over the next few sessions I kept coming back, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand what had changed inside me. And one day Dr. Hayes asked, "What do you feel when Daniel Carter thinks about Emily Harper now?" And I answered honestly, "Nothing strong, just distance." And Dr. Hayes said, "That's not emptiness, that's healing." And I sat there for a second, processing that before saying, "It doesn't feel like healing, it just feels quiet." And Dr. Hayes smiled slightly, "Healing is often quiet," and that stayed with me, because everything about my life now felt quiet, not in a lonely way but in a controlled, steady way. And outside of those sessions I started rebuilding everything piece by piece, focusing on work, setting goals, creating routines that had nothing to do with the past. And one afternoon Lena Brooks noticed again, saying, "Daniel Carter looks lighter," and I smiled slightly, replying, "That's one way to put it." And Lena Brooks tilted head, "So what changed?" And I answered simply, "Daniel Carter stopped carrying things that weren't Daniel Carter's to carry." And Lena Brooks nodded slowly, "That sounds like growth." And I said, "It is." And Marcus Reed saw it too when we met one evening, and Marcus Reed said, "There's something different about you now." And I replied, "Daniel Carter is different." And Marcus Reed smirked slightly, "In a good way," and I nodded, "In a real way," and Marcus Reed leaned back, "So no regrets?" And I thought about that for a moment before answering, "No." And Marcus Reed raised an eyebrow, "Not even a little?" And I shook my head, "Daniel Carter regrets staying too long, but not leaving." And Marcus Reed smiled, "That's fair." And as the days turned into weeks I noticed something I hadn't expected. I wasn't looking back anymore, not even out of curiosity, not even to check if anything had changed, because it didn't matter. And during one session Dr. Hayes asked, "If Emily Harper walked in right now, what would Daniel Carter say?" And I paused, thinking carefully before answering, "Nothing." And Dr. Hayes nodded, "And how does that make Daniel Carter feel?" And I replied, "Free." And Dr. Hayes smiled, "Exactly." And I leaned back slightly, letting that word sink in, because that's what this was, not loneliness, not loss, just freedom. And for the first time in a long time I felt like I was building something that actually belonged to me, not something dependent on someone else, not something fragile, but something solid, something real. And one evening as I sat alone, looking out at the city lights, I said quietly to myself, "Daniel Carter didn't lose everything. Daniel Carter found the truth, and that truth didn't hurt anymore, it didn't weigh me down, it didn't define me, it just existed, and I accepted it." And as I stood up, moving forward without hesitation, I realized something simple but powerful. I wasn't broken, I wasn't damaged, I was just new, and for the first time that felt like enough. I didn't expect to see Emily Harper again, not like that, not in a random moment when everything had already settled inside me, but there Emily Harper was, standing a few feet away as I walked out of a cafe, and for a second, everything slowed, not because of emotion, but because of recognition, and Emily Harper looked at me the same way too, surprised, almost unsure, and then Emily Harper said quietly, "Daniel Carter?" And I stopped, turning fully, meeting Emily Harper's eyes without hesitation, without the tension that used to live there, and I replied simply, "Yeah." And there was a brief silence, the kind that used to feel heavy but now just felt empty, and Emily Harper stepped a little closer, saying, "I didn't think I'd see Daniel Carter again," and I nodded slightly, "Neither did Daniel Carter," and Emily Harper looked down for a moment before speaking again, voice softer this time, "Can we talk?" And I thought about it for a second, not because I needed to, but because it felt like the right thing to do, and I said, "For a minute," and we moved to the side, standing near the sidewalk, and Emily Harper took a breath before saying, "Daniel Carter. I'm sorry," and I watched Emily Harper carefully, not searching for truth, not trying to read between the lines, just listening, and Emily Harper continued, "Everything that happened, I handled it wrong. I hurt Daniel Carter," and I nodded once, calmly replying, "Yeah," and Emily Harper looked at me, almost expecting more, maybe expecting anger or questions or something deeper, but I didn't give any of that, and Emily Harper asked quietly, "That's it?" And I shrugged slightly, "What else is there to say?" And Emily Harper looked confused, almost unsettled. "Daniel Carter used to have so much to say," and I replied, "Daniel Carter used to feel a lot more," and that hung there for a moment, and Emily Harper swallowed, asking, "Do you hate me?" And I shook my head, "No," and Emily Harper blinked, surprised, "Then what do you feel?" And I paused, searching for the most honest answer before saying, "Nothing," and that word landed heavier than anything else could have, because Emily Harper stepped back slightly, like it was something unexpected, something harder to hear than anger, and Emily Harper whispered, "Nothing?" And I nodded, "Yeah," and there was silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward, it wasn't tense, it was just final, and Emily Harper looked at me for a long second before saying, "I thought, maybe things could be different now," and I shook my head gently, "They already are," and Emily Harper frowned slightly, "What does that mean?" And I replied calmly, "It means Daniel Carter moved on," and Emily Harper's eyes softened, but there was something else there too, something like regret, and Emily Harper said quietly, "I messed everything up," and I didn't argue, didn't comfort, just said, "Yeah," and Emily Harper let out a shaky breath. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone, and I looked at Emily Harper steadily, responding, "That happens?" And Emily Harper looked down again, voice barely above a whisper, "Do you ever think about it, about us?" And I answered honestly, "Not anymore," and Emily Harper nodded slowly, like that answer hurt but also made sense, and after a moment, Emily Harper said, "I'm glad you're doing okay," and I replied, "Daniel Carter is better than okay," and that seemed to surprise Emily Harper, but I could see it, the realization setting in that I wasn't the same person anymore, not the one who would wait, not the one who would stay, and Emily Harper asked softly, "So this is really it?" And I nodded, "Yeah," and there was one last pause, one last moment where something could have been said, something emotional, something dramatic, but neither of us did, and Emily Harper finally said, "Goodbye, Daniel Carter?" And I replied, "Goodbye," and as Emily Harper turned and walked away, I didn't watch for long, didn't feel the need to hold on to the moment, and I turned in the opposite direction, continuing forward, and as I walked, I realized something simple but undeniable, that there was no weight left, no questions, no unfinished feelings, just a quiet certainty that what I had walked away from was truly behind me, and I said softly to myself, "That's it," not with sadness, not with relief, just with understanding, because for the first time I didn't just know I had moved on. I felt it completely. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the city lights stretching endlessly in front of me, and for the first time in a long time, there was no noise in my head, no questions, no doubts, just quiet, steady peace, and I rested my hands on the railing, taking a slow breath as I said softly to myself, "Daniel Carter made it," not in a dramatic way, not like I had won something, but like I had finally found something that mattered, and my phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of that moment just slightly, and when I checked it, I saw Lena Brooks' name, and the message was simple, "Dinner tomorrow?" And I stared at it for a second, not because I didn't know what to say, but because of how different it felt, how light it felt compared to everything that came before, and I smiled without even realizing it, replying, "Yeah," and as soon as I sent it, I leaned back against the railing, letting that small moment settle, because it wasn't just about dinner, it was about something bigger, something new, something that didn't carry the weight of the past. And Marcus Reed called a little later, and when I answered, Marcus Reed said, "You sound different," and I chuckled quietly. "Different how?" And Marcus Reed replied, "Calm," like everything finally clicked, and I nodded slightly. "It did?" And Marcus Reed asked, "So what now?" And I looked out at the city again, answering simply, "Now Daniel Carter lives." And Marcus Reed laughed softly, "About time," and I smiled, "Yeah, about time." And after the call ended, I stayed there for a while, just watching the lights, thinking about everything that had happened, not with regret, not with anger, just with understanding, because every moment, every mistake, every silence had led me here. And I said quietly, "Daniel Carter knows what Daniel Carter is worth now," and that truth felt stronger than anything I had held on to before. And the next day when I met Lena Brooks smiled as soon as Lena Brooks saw me and said, "Daniel Carter looks good," and I replied lightly, "Daniel Carter feels good." And Lena Brooks laughed, "That's even better," and we sat down talking easily, naturally, without pressure, without expectation. And Lena Brooks asked, "So what changed?" And I thought about it for a second before answering, "Daniel Carter stopped settling," and Lena Brooks nodded, "That's a powerful shift." And I smiled slightly, "It is," and the conversation flowed from there, simple things, real things, nothing forced, nothing heavy. And as I sat there, I realized how different everything felt, how present I was, how I wasn't holding back or second-guessing anything. And later that evening as I walked back home, I looked around at the city again, at the life I was building, and I said softly, "This is mine," not as a claim but as a realization, because this time, everything I had was something I chose, something I built, something I deserved. And when I stepped back onto my balcony that night, the same lights stretched out in front of me, but this time they felt different, not distant, not overwhelming, just open, like possibilities instead of memories. And I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the railing as I whispered, "No more fear," because that was the biggest change, not just that I had moved on, but that I wasn't afraid to start again, wasn't afraid to trust myself, to choose better, to walk away when something wasn't right. And as my phone buzzed again with another message from Lena Brooks, something light, something easy, I smiled, not because I needed anything from it, but because I wanted it, because this time I was choosing my life, not reacting to it. And as I stood there in the quiet, surrounded by the city lights, I understood something simple and final, that I didn't just leave the past behind. I became someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew exactly what Daniel Carter deserved, and for the first time that was enough.